Hello and welcome to Dig School, cross-curricular learning themed around archaeology. This session is What's the Story? When we'll be exploring the significance of finds from test pit excavations. Key questions will be, can you puzzle out an unusual test pit find? Can you establish the significance of everyday finds from test pit excavations? And what's the story? So first of all, here's an unusual find for you to puzzle out from a test pit excavation. The test pit was here in this garden. You can see it circled in red, and in the background there's a church tower, and you can see all the finds and equipment spread out. You'll be familiar with those if you've dug your own test pit or done some of the earlier Dig School workshops on test pit digging. So all was quite normal until we discovered the item at the bottom of the test pit here, just above the trowel. The students excavating it first thought it might be a bowl, but actually it's a very, very recognisable sort of find if you're an archaeologist and you're familiar with this sort of thing. A colleague of mine who was a specialist in human remains immediately got in the test pit, excavated a bit further, because we could see immediately it was a human skull. And you can see it there, cleaned slightly further back with the eye sockets just visible. So there were a few things we could say about the buried person. We didn't excavate any more of it than just the skull, but we could, well, it was quite clear they weren't buried in the current graveyard, it was somebody's garden. It's close to the church, but not within it. They'd been buried on their back. We could tell that because the eye sockets were looking upwards. The head was to the west. Again, we could see which was the top of the head and which was the bottom. And their feet, therefore, we presume, the skeletons are quite predictable, were to the east. And they had light brow ridges, so they were probably female, though that doesn't always work out. And they'd been there for at least a few hundred years. The layers above them showed that there'd been nothing disturbed recently, and the skull was discoloured from having been in the ground for a long time. That's why it's that dark sort of brown colour. So the question really was, why were they there? It's a Christian-style burial on the back with the head to the west. So why weren't they in the graveyard? There seem to be three possible explanations. So I'll go through each of those and listen carefully to what these scenarios look like archaeologically, and then you decide which you think is the most similar to our test pit discovery. So the first possibility was that the person had been excluded from the graveyard as some sort of punishment. Maybe they'd committed a crime and were considered not entitled to be buried in the graveyard. Now we do find that from time to time. So there was a really interesting example from Warren Percy in Yorkshire, where analysis of bones from excavation, or particularly had been found in a sort of a pit, in fact, in the village. Again, there was a churchyard in the village, but these bones mostly had been found in a pit. 137 of them dating between the 11th and 14th centuries, sort of the high medieval period, the same sort of date perhaps as our skeleton from the test pit, or our skull from the test pit. They had evidence of ancient practices which the archaeologists suggested were things carried out to stop these sort of ghosts, the zombies, if you like, rising from the grave, spreading disease and assaulting the living, which people were quite worried about. 10 people, those 137 bones came from 10 people at least. They'd been decapitated and dismembered. There were knife marks. You can see them just on the rib here in this news story item. Most in the head and neck area. There was also evidence for burning of some of the body parts, of deliberately breaking of some of the bones after death, but no evidence for cannibalism. The cut marks weren't in the right place for that. And analysis suggested that the dead were local people, so they weren't invaders coming in from outside. You can see here's a close-up of those cut marks on the rib there, and on the right-hand side, that's a fragment of one of the skulls showing the burning to it. So that might be what we might expect something to look like if this was a question of someone being punished and buried outside of the grave because of that. Now, the second possibility was that they might have been the victim of a violent or illegal killing in some way, or perhaps in battle, and were buried hastily to hide them, or disrespectfully just to get them out of the way by perhaps the person who'd killed them. Now again, we do find this happens from time to time. The most common scenario for it is a battle cemetery after some sort of episode of warfare. A recent example of this was discovered from the Battle of Towton, part of the English Civil War that Richard III, whose body was famously rediscovered recently, same sort of period as that. Archaeologists, well, some workmen actually found the skeletons first, and then archaeologists excavated them. They found 43 individuals from one grave pit that was only about 6 metres by 2 metres, so not very big to have 43 people in it. Detailed analysis showed dramatic injuries on nearly all of them, and that all of the skeletons were male. The injuries had been inflicted by sort of weapons of war, swords, knives, war hammers, and so on. You can see the skull here has got a slash mark that's cut right across the face. No sign that that person survived that at all. There's no bone healing. And this is what this pit looked like when it was excavated. The line drawing on the left is a little bit difficult to see clearly in this picture here. But on the right, I think you can get an idea of quite how crowded together all those skeletons were. The third possible explanation for our test pit skull is that actually the area normally used for official Christian burials has changed, so that this person was originally buried in a normal way in a Christian cemetery, but actually the boundaries of that cemetery have changed. The area they're buried in is no longer inside graveyard. And again, we do find this happening. So there's an excavation here at a castle site, and when we were excavating there, we found a pair of human legs. The other end of the skeleton, of course, from the one we found in the test pit. You can see again how discoloured the bones are from having been in the sort of orangey soil. There's been subsequent excavations there, and while you can look at these skeletons and you can see a photograph on the left-hand side, there's a complete skeleton on the very left-hand side. There's one in the middle there which is missing its head, and then there's one on the right-hand side there just sort of disappearing into the back of the trench, where there's only actually a very small number of bones left from the sort of left-hand side. Now that might look very disrespectful, but actually that's damage that's happened after that cemetery's gone out of use. And what you can see is how very regularly and parallel those skeletons are laid out. Again, they're on their backs and with their heads to the west and their feet to the east. And in the picture on the right-hand side there, that's more excavations in the same area, found other skeletons, again, all laid out parallel on their backs with their heads to the west. So very standard Christian cemetery, radiocarbon dated to the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, in an area that has not been used for burial for certainly 800 or 900 years. There, the extent of the area used for burial has clearly changed. So those are the three possible explanations for the test pit, the skull we found in that test pit. So have a think and write down in your workbook which explanation you think is most likely to account for the presence of the skull, and we presume the rest of the body, in the test pit there. Give reasons for your answer. Say why you think the explanation you've chosen is the right one, by saying why you think it matches the evidence most closely. If you think there's another explanation, then do write that down. and again, give explanations for it. And if you really want to come up with some good ideas, suggest what we might do as archaeologists to try and test which of those hypotheses, which of those ideas is right. So now you've had time to think, talk and write down which of those explanations you think is right. Well, we don't know for definite because we've only got the skull, but my suspicion is that it's not a punishment excavation, a punishment burial. It looks too conventional. It seems to be that that person was buried in the normal Christian way, even though we can only see their skull. So it doesn't look like a punishment burial. It certainly doesn't look like anything that was found at Warren Percy. No burns, no cut marks on the bit we can see. Doesn't look like the victim of a violent killing or a hasty burial like we saw from that Towton cemetery. There's no sign of any injury, though of course somebody could have died from an injury that didn't leave a mark on the skull. But equally, it's just the single burial as far as we can see. There don't appear to be any other burials with it. And again, it is buried in a respectful Christian way. So it doesn't look like someone just trying to get rid of it somehow. And it's also buried quite deep. So my suspicion is that it's simply the case that the size of the graveyard has changed. Perhaps it was originally larger, perhaps the village was larger, perhaps the church was originally sited a bit further towards the west. There may have been a timber church, a wooden church that was rebuilt and in stone, which as you can see is what it's built of now. And perhaps they built it a little bit further to the east, and perhaps the graveyard moved at the same time. Of course, the way to find that out would be to do some more extensive excavations in that same area, but that might take up rather a lot of that person's rather nice garden. But that would probably be the best way to establish for sure, to find more of that skeleton and then see if there are any others like there were in that cemetery in the castle at Clare, the last example I showed you. So I hope you enjoyed having a look at that. Most test pits do not turn up human remains. They're vanishingly uncommon in test pits. But because of that, the finds from test pits, because actually they're more everyday, they can tell us a lot about life in the past if you know what to look for. So if you want to have a break, that's the end of part 1. And then part 2, we'll have a look at the significance of finds from your test pits, whether you excavated them with a shovel or a dice. So in part 2 of What's the Story, we're going to look at finding out the significance of finds from test pits. Now, if you haven't excavated your test pit, or if you haven't already played the test pit excavation game from the previous dig school, then pop back to that, get a copy of the board from the workbook for Dig School 15 and collect yourself some finds. It's very simple. The game board is on the screen now. All you need is a dice, and you just roll your way around the board and mark a cross on every square you land on that has any finds. The finds are from your different 10 centimetres layer. You start at the top where it says start, up in the grass, and effectively you go through the board, you're going down through the layers of that test pit. So the top context is labelled number 1, that's the top row. Second context is the second row. The third context is the third row, and so on. This doesn't make any sense to you, either just carry on or go back and do the dig schools 12, 13, 14, 15, which will run you up to that. So By the time you've done that, you'll have a board that might look something like this, a load of crosses, and if you've got any really special finds, mark those with a star, things that aren't made of pottery or flint or animal bone. Once you've done that, or if you've got your own finds from your excavation, you can think about the significance. And once you understand the significance, you'll be able to say and understand what this tells us about the past. Now we'll explore this using an unusual technique, top trumps. So you've got your game card, your game board, and in your workbook there is an example of a top trumps card, a blank top trumps card. You can also print out as many of these as you want to fill in, as many as you have finds for. So the way this works is for each of the squares in your game, or each of the finds you have, you write at the top the name of that find. So square 1, for example, on the game board is a clear glass marble with a coloured eye. So clear glass marble, you write in the top in the square that's outlined in red there. And then you write down the context where it was found. On your game board there, if it's in the top row, it's context number 1. If it's in the second row, context number 2, and so on. And then you write the number of items. Now, some of the squares may say it's a piece of pottery times 2, in which case it'll be 2 items. Some squares you may land on more than once, because the game's a bit like snakes and ladders, and sometimes you have to go backwards. So you can see on the board there that some of the squares have got 2 crosses on them. So if you've got sort of Thetford ware 2 sherds and you land on that twice, that's 4 sherds. So write down the number of items in the right hand of those 2 squares outlined in red there. You then need to fill in all the categories that you'll actually score on to play the top trumps game. And these are the oldest date, the date your item began, the date it ended, that it went out of use, how commonly it's found, its frequency, how durable it is in archaeological contexts, its value at the time to people, and then what does it tell us? And so there's a sheet which you can either download or print off or have to refer on your computer that goes with this session of Dig School, which will have all of this information for all of the finds on that game board. So just have a look through them and fill in those 6 boxes. There's a little bit more space at the bottom for the bottom one, because the what does it tell us is a bit of a longer explanation. So just to go back to the marble as an example, you can see it as oldest dates, about 1903, that's when commercially milled marble started to be made out of glass with those eyes in the middle. The most recent date, well, they go up to the present. The frequency, how often are they found in test pits? Now this is scored out of 2,000 because I've dug at least 2,000 test pits, so that's what I can compare it to. There's about 50 of them perhaps have produced marbles, so it gets a score of 50. Durability, I'll come back to that in a minute, and to value. And then what does it tell us? It tells us that children were playing here using relatively cheap toys, but ones that were very popular. There's a wide range of games that were played, but a lot of them involved losing marbles because you were throwing marbles and it's easy for them to get lost. So plastic carrier bag, the next item down, well, it's telling you that people have bought things at shops or supermarkets and that people have thrown away their rubbish there. And again, you've got the start date and it goes up to the present day. And this list goes through all of the objects on that game sheet in more or less the order that they appear on the game sheet in the numbered squares. Some things don't really have a start date or an end date because they can't be dated by anything apart from the context that they're in, the layer that they're in. We can only date things like animal bone by saying, well, it's probably the same date as the finds. For anything that says it's undateable out of context, you get a 0 for that date category, both those date categories. Looking at durability and value, each of those is scored durability. There's 4 categories. It's either indestructible, like that glass marble, really, once those are made, once they're in the soil, they stay there pretty much forever unless someone really smashes them, deliberately to pieces. Some things survive very well in most conditions. A lot of well-made pottery, for example, survives very well in most conditions. Animal bone survives well in most conditions. Other things survive well if buried, but not on the surface. And smaller bits of animal bone certainly tend to not survive well if they're on the surface of a ploughed field, say. And then there are other items that are really delicate, like some earlier pottery is really very friable and tends to just fall away to pieces very easily. And then there's value. So there's things that are free, they really have no value, they either occur naturally or they're given away free, or they're repurposed, or they've been rubbish. Some things are cheap, those are the things that nearly everybody could afford or could get. There are things that are affordable or acquirable by most people, and there are things that are expensive that most people wouldn't have had. And then there are things that are really exclusive, that only a very few of the wealthiest or the most elite sort of sites or people would have had. So using all of that information, you can work through and fill in a top trumps card for every one of the finds you've had from either playing your board game or from your excavations. What you can do to do a really professional looking card is actually put some pictures in. So there's the pottery identification sheets. You can copy the pictures from that if you've got, and then draw the picture in the box. If you've got other finds, you can go to the website here, the Portable Antiquities Scheme website, and have a look for items and copy those. Or you can find, if you're doing it on a computer, you can find pictures online and paste those in. So have a bit of fun with it if you feel like doing that. Take as long as you want to put your card together. So this is just one example for some Stanford ware pottery. It was found in context 6. It was just one bit of it, and he landed on that square once, and it was only one sherd there. There's a picture of it there that I've pasted in from the pottery identification sheet. And there's the date it began, the date it ended, how commonly is it found in test pits, how durable is it? 2, it's reasonably durable in most contexts. How expensive, valuable is it? Well, it seems to be quite posh for its time, so that's got a 4. And then it's what does it tell us about it? People are acquiring and using this particular sort of pottery, and you can see the detailed information there. Don't forget to put your name on each card that you do, because you're going to be playing a game with them in a moment, and you need to be able to recover your own cards at the end. So if you can't print out the cards, then just write the answers to all those questions on a sheet of paper, and then use the game board to sort of find out which card to play in turn. So just throw the dice, move the number of squares that you've got crosses or stars on, and that'll be the card you'll play, and then refer to your sheet, and you can see what your scores are in each of those 6 categories. For the what does it tell us category, or what does it mean, that's one for you to score. Give it a score yourselves out of 20 for how important you think it is, or how significant you think it is, what it's telling you that is useful to know. Once you've done that for all of your finds, you're ready to play Test Pit Top Trumps. So the normal rules apply. You toss a coin to see who starts. The winner looks at the top card of their pile. You can shuffle them, of course, and put them face down, turn the top one over, have a look at it. The person who's starting chooses the category they think that card's most likely to win in, calls out their score. Everybody else calls out their score in the same category. And whoever's score is highest takes all of the cards, puts them to the bottom of their pile, takes their next card, chooses a category. They carry on doing that until they lose, and then the winner chooses the next category. For these specific cards, the date began, the longest ago date wins for that. The date ended category, it's the most recent date wins. in the category of how commonly found is it, it's the highest number. How durable, it's the lowest number wins. But if you've got multiple numbers of finds, you can multiply your score by the number of finds you've got. How expensive or exclusive, the highest number wins. And then what does it tell us? That one you're scoring yourself, that's the highest number again. If you tie, the person who called the category originally chooses the second category. So have fun playing Test Pit Top Trumps. So I hope you enjoyed playing Top Trumps. In this slightly unusual category, maybe you've decided you want to go back and change some of the scores you gave for the value for some of the things. Maybe you won, maybe you lost, but whether you won or lost the game, what you can now do is explain the significance of all of those finds that you've made, either from your test pit or from playing the board game, context by context from each of those layers. Because what you've done now is assemble all of that information about its date and about its significance, about what it's telling you. So you can now go through and write an account explaining the significance of your finds, each context, as you go down into deeper and older deposits. Of course, when you do this, make sure that at the end of playing the game, you get back your own cards, because those are the ones you now need to use to write up your account of your test pit excavation. You can just work through the cards. All of the information's handily assembled there. Finish your account, sort of concluding by saying, when you look at those different layers and what the cards are telling you, what the finds are telling you was going on there, things changed over time, and if so, in what ways? That's a really good way to round off your analysis of the significance of your finds from the test pit. So I hope you enjoyed that dig school. I hope you enjoyed trying to puzzle out that unusual test pit find the skull at the beginning. I hope you enjoyed playing the top trumps, and I hope you enjoyed finding that as a way to establish the significance of those everyday finds. And of course, the ones that you didn't do top trumps cards for, you've still got the lists there if they come up in excavation, or if you want to play the whole board game again, get a completely different assemblage, make some new top trumps cards. You can do this as often as you like. And I hope you've also now found a good way to work out what's the story of your test pit by saying, what are the finds telling us about what's going on in each period as we went down through time, and how things changed over time. So I hope you enjoyed that session of Dig School, and I hope to see you at another Dig School again sometime soon.